Please come in, sit down, and we will get started. You should have gotten an evaluation on the way in, just to let you know. You will have time at the end, so you don't need to fill it out now if you haven't finished. Because I want to make sure that we get started on time, because we have a very busy guest. It is my honor to introduce Stephanie A. Miner, who is the 53rd mayor of the city of Syracuse. She, like many of the other people you've met, is an alum, in this case of Syracuse University. She graduated magna cum laude with a BA in political science and journalism in 1992. After graduating from Syracuse, she worked as the assistant upstate coordinator for Geraldine Ferraro for U.S. Senate, and then served as Central New York regional representative to Governor Mario Cuomo in 1994. In 1999, Mayor Miner earned her JD from SUNY Buffalo and began working at Blitman & King, LLP, as a labor lawyer representing unions and employees. Already deeply involved in politics at that time, Mayor Miner became a Syracuse Common Councilor at large in 2002 after winning a citywide election in 2001 when she was 31 years old. She was reelected to the council in 2005 when she received the most votes of any candidate on the ballot, including the incumbent mayor. As a councilor, she championed and helped pass legislation that gave $1 million in initial funding to the Say Yes to Education program, which you've already heard referenced several times during this week, which is an extremely exciting initiative in the city. It provides necessary support services for Syracuse City School District students, and it promises free or reduced tuition to students who graduate from the Syracuse public school system. Mayor Miner was elected mayor on November 3rd, 2009 in a three-way race, receiving 50.1% of the vote, and at that time she became the first woman elected mayor of any of the big 5 cities in New York State. So it is my pleasure and honor to welcome Mayor Stephanie Miner.
Thank you very much. It is a real privilege and a pleasure to be here in front of you today. Although I will tell you that when I had to put on my suit jacket to come here because I knew that this was an august group, I had some secondary thoughts given the temperature that it is outside. So I am jealous of you in a number of ways, not the least of which is the ability to go and wake up every morning and wear t-shirts and shorts. I no longer have that ability. And it's one that I sorely miss, by the way. But I'm actually more profoundly jealous of you because of the opportunities that you have in front of you to engage in learning full-time. There are some, and it's often said that youth is lost on the young. To have an opportunity to spend your waking hours thinking about great thoughts and great problems and solutions is indeed a rare privilege. And unfortunately, it is a privilege that I think is becoming more rare for Americans than it has been in the past. And I want to talk somewhat about those issues and about where we find ourselves in the world from my vantage point. Which I will start off right away saying that you're going to get a view of the world from somebody who is a mayor of a city in a state and in a country that is undergoing major changes. And when I received the invitation to be your speaker and I saw that the topic of your colloquium was management and policy in a resource-constrained world, I started thinking, well, how appropriate, because that's exactly where we are. But because I was coming to Maxwell, I started thinking about it more than just a superficial way. And what I realized was that that's pretty much the status quo of government as we know it. There is never enough money. There are always more problems than there are resources. And lest you think that I haven't done my homework or haven't thought about this, let me give you some examples. In 1765, the British government enacted the Stamp Act. And the purpose was to help pay for troops who were stationed in North America at that time. Now, because you're all here in front of me, you know what happened as a result of the Stamp Act. In 1773, as a result of financial problems in the British East India Company was having, the then government enacted the Tea Act, which resulted in the Boston Tea Party. Later on, after we had our War of Revolution in 1786 and 1787, as we were struggling between the Articles of Confederation and the Constitution, there was a post-war economic depression that had incredible financial implications and difficulties for the colonists, or then Americans, which resulted in Scho's Rebellion, which resulted ultimately in one of the precipitating acts in allowing the 13 independent colonies to come together and agree on a constitution. I say that to you so that you can understand, while we all feel that our challenges are the most challenging and pressing of any generation that's gone before, they really are not. Everything is seen in a context of where you are. Those of you who are here need to understand that as you think about governance and management and policy going forward, that history and understanding history and where we've been as Americans and where we are as people in the world will help inform us as to how we make decisions. In this modern day, we struggle with what came to be known as, in LBJ's time, as the issue of guns and butter. As Americans, we are paying for 2 wars, we are paying for occupations, and yet at the same time, we have a huge number of citizens who are ill-fed, ill-clothed, ill-educated. And as public servants, our first goal is often to figure out, how do we decide how much money to put towards guns, how much money to put towards butter? And whether you are a congressman or a senator or a mayor, we are all Americans and we all should vote. And so that, thinking about resources as Americans and thinking about the way that we want to prioritize, is a very important part of how you move forward, regardless of whether you end up in public service or not. I am hopeful that most of you will, given that you find yourselves here. But some of you may decide not to, or some of you may take the kind of curlicue routes that a lot of us did and find ourselves in places that we never expected. But you will all be expected to add to your country and add to your civilization. And of course, in a democracy, it is a profound right and privilege to vote. And when you vote and how you vote, these are the kind of things that you have to think about and the responsibilities. Now, as an American, I'm going to say that what we are talking about and what I'm talking about with you today is a uniquely American struggle. What is government's role in progress? I say it's uniquely American because that's the only vantage point that I have. Some of you are from other countries may disagree with that, but we can take that up in questions and answers. In the United States, because of our history, we have this profound tension between rugged individualism and the collective good. We all fancy ourselves to come from this place where our history is rising up against authority, vis-a-vis the revolution, rising up against authority as cowboys in the history of the West. And whether or not you understand that, it has a profound influence on decisions that we make as a society. And let me give you an example of this. As a mayor, it is my privilege to represent and solve problems and meet people every day who, in their breadth of circumstances, gives me both hope and a sense of wonder. And it is not unusual for me to have people come to see me who are struggling with mental health issues, substance abuse, or just maybe different. And so they will say to me things like, Mayor, I know that an alien came down and stole my car. And they will say that in the first sentence. And then the second sentence is, they will say, and I know I have rights. And I know that you can't take those cars away from me because I have rights that are guaranteed to me. And I say that to you to say, imagine, if you will, for a second, how profound that sense of the Bill of Rights is in our culture and in our country, that you have people who have only the barest sense, a grasp of reality as we understand it, but they know as Americans they're guaranteed those rights. And the further away you get from that and towards sort of in the gradations of closer to what I think some of us would view as reality, the further people understand that. Even people who would fancy themselves, and we have a couple in Syracuse who refer to themselves as left-leaning socialists. But they know their rights, and they know the Bill of Rights, and they know about freedom of speech, and they know about freedom of assembly, and they know that the government, the city of Syracuse, cannot tell them that they cannot stand on a street corner with a bullhorn and preach. We cannot forbid that they have that right to do that. So as you think about this, then you have to juxtapose that with the collective good. And the collective good in terms of the Constitution, one of our founding documents, talks about, both in the preamble and in the taxing clause, which last week came into sharp focus for our country, about promoting the general welfare. So how do you promote the general welfare at the same time that you give people this American sense that the government has no role in any way in clipping their wings and figuring out how they want to live their life? It is between those two concepts that we have American history. And it is between those two concepts, that tension, that you get governing. Now, this struggle between rugged individualism and collective good has been punctuated by skirmishes. Like I talked about, the Stamp Act was a skirmish. Shays' Rebellion was a skirmish, an outright conflagration. The Boston Tea Party, a conflagration. The American Revolution, Lexington and Concord, a conflagration. So what separates outright war, if you will, and revolution from having an intellectual debate about what the proper decision is, the proper policy? My view is that leadership is what separates the two, and that we in the United States have had the profound luck, and some would say divine guidance, to have incredible leadership at times where our country was threatened by being torn apart. Obviously, Abraham Lincoln comes to mind, and there are many issues in the Civil War that we don't initially think about when you talk about the Civil War, what caused the Civil War, but if you dig deeper, and I know you all here have dug very deeply, the tension between collective good and when a society has to decide what is moral, immoral, or property rights, or the basis of an economy, and when others say that's my individual right, was what indeed was one of the major struggles of that. Abraham Lincoln, through that conflagration, saw us through and was not a purist in his thinking about policies and decisions. He was a purist about the United States, and it should stay together as a unit. The other time that I think about, that I've read a lot about, is right after the Great Depression or during the Great Depression. Another time when the country was threatened by being ripped apart and by absolute revolutions. And what happened there is you had a president who got elected and was a complete and total pragmatist. And in the first 100 days, totally revolutionized the way that we think about government and what government could do, and most importantly, what government should do for the collective good. And in many ways, the tension that came between in the first 100 days and afterwards, in FDR's terms, about reacting to a very conservative court, and how you had a government that said we are not going to be constrained by this thinking, and we need to think about, more broadly, the general welfare. There are others who are a lot smarter than I am and a lot more well-known, who say that the depth of the fiscal crisis is what determines whether or not it becomes a skirmish or it becomes violent. Most notably that I have seen as recently is Thomas Sargent, who was awarded the Nobel Prize in economics. And he was recently quoted, they were asking him about what was going on in Europe and the crisis, and in particular with the euro and the Greek economy. And one of the things that he said was, fiscal crises tends to lead to political revolutions. And he talked about example after example of that. And I think we in the United States, because we have had this history of having leadership steer us away from these political revolutions, are somewhat immune or don't understand how real that threat can be when you have this divide between the haves and the have-nots. And yet, the rest of the world knows that experience firsthand. So we get back to what I said is the fundamental question in American government. I believe the fundamental question that everybody has to answer first and foremost, and that is, what is government's role in progress? Now for that, I'm going to give you my bias and my view, and I will also tell you that there are people who disagree with me on this. I believe that government is integral to removing inequity, and I believe removing inequity is integral to having a healthy and vibrant democracy. And while I believe that rugged individualism is an important part of our background and our history and should play a role in how we make governing decisions, I do not believe that if we use that lens alone that we will come up with the right decisions. And the way that I view American history is that we have not. So for someone who thinks about this, it means that when people talk about the wealth of nations and Adam Smith and the invisible hand, and those of you who are economists, I'm sure are big fans of this theory, and Adam Smith said, you know what, essentially, I'm going to paraphrase it in 21st Syracuse American English. Adam Smith said, I know of no one who in and of himself, when he tried to do public good, actually ended up doing public good. Instead, he said, you know what, it's the invisible hand. When everybody acts in their own rational self-interest, the public good actually ends up happening in and of its own. I don't believe that. A little more modern became the laissez-faire, just, let markets function on their own, and government should not be a regulator. I don't believe in that either, and I will give you example after example of why I don't think that that makes sense. And in fact, I think what happens is if you become tied to those orthodoxies, what we will have is an existence, to paraphrase somebody else, that is nasty, brutish, and short for most people in the United States. If you think about the world that we come from, if we were to had adhered to those orthodoxies, we would still have children working in sweatshops. There wouldn't be no such thing as a 40-hour work week. There wouldn't be compulsory public education. And there wouldn't be such modern things as the GI Bill or Social Security. And yet, in 2012, we have an entire leading thinkers in our public policy realms who are devoted to these philosophers. And another one that's become very vogue recently, Ayn Rand, the rational self-interest and the fountainhead, and I read the book and saw the movie. I don't think that that is a governing philosophy. But again, there are many in our country, many who in positions of much greater influence than I am in, who believe that those should be, and that the ills that we are suffering as a country are because we have steered too far away from rational self-interest. For me, the basic problem with rational self-interest is that we have a growing inequity in our country and in our society. And if you allow rational self-interest to be the governing doctrine of how you make decisions, you will never see that inequity get any smaller. It will only grow, because the people who have the power and the resources will continue to make sure that only their power and their resources and the people that they like will have access to it. Let me give you another sort of modern world example of how I see this. When I was younger, much younger than I am, there was a concept of, there was middle class and there was working class. So middle class, you had upper middle class and lower middle class, but there was also working class. And working class meant that people who had jobs, sometimes mostly service jobs or other kinds of jobs, but they had health insurance, they had pensions, and they could buy a house, and they could take care of their families, and they could send their kids to school, and their kids would be able to succeed to wherever their character or their intellect took them. As a mayor in the city of Syracuse, I can tell you that there is no such thing anymore as working class. It doesn't exist. There are working poor. They don't have health insurance. They don't have pensions. And one of my profound challenges as mayor is to be able to give them a school system where they can send their children so their children can succeed. And I worry about that a lot. Our African American male graduation rate in the city of Syracuse is 20%. When the working class has disappeared, that is a concept, the middle class is, I know a few people who really think of themselves as middle class anymore. And then you have this idea of the 99% versus the 1%, which is very real. And the divides just keep getting wider and wider. Because for a long time, we as Americans thought to ourselves, told ourselves, and I think to this day believe, that the rugged individual part of our society says, every individual will have the opportunity in this country to succeed on their own merits based on their intellect and their character, and there is nothing that will hold them back. And yet, when you have school systems, particularly urban school systems, across the United States that are graduating less than 50% of their children, when you have graduation rates like I just told you, and by the way, Syracuse is not unique. When you have those kind of graduation rates across the country, somebody doesn't graduate from high school, they're not going to be working class, they're not going to be middle class. The numbers will tell you they will be dead or in jail by the time they're 25. But even if you graduate from high school now, our economy is getting so that you need to have a college education, to have a job where you can get health insurance, where you can take care of yourself. So we said, we'll give you student loans. But now those student loans, as I'm preaching to the choir here, I know, have become so enormous that people are graduating with mortgages for 30 years. And they're graduating, and the marketplace is so soft that nobody's getting jobs. So what does that say for the American dream? And then you have this other sort of more subtle bias that I have noticed a lot more too, that certain places where they are very prestigious, appointments. So for example, if you are a graduate of a law school and you're in your top percent, you're in the law review, and if you get a clerkship in federal courts, that's very, very prestigious. And that's almost a guarantee of a very good job. But now, because of the enormous debt that students have and that government has cut back, none of those positions are paid. So who gets those positions? People whose families can afford to support them for the year or two while they do it, knowing that if you do that, in 2 years you're going to get a great job and make it. But what about all of the families that don't have those resources to do that? And what about all of those students who have the brains and the capability and want to do that, but can't because they're held back because of a lack of resources? So for me, what I see is very troubling. And again, I'm a Democrat. This is the way I look at things. I'm a mayor. This is the way I look at things. But for me, as somebody trying to rise above, if you will, or take a broader view than just as a mayor or as a Democrat, as an American, what I am most deeply concerned about is that we have found ourselves in a place in this country where orthodoxy has triumphed over pragmatism, and that is uniquely un-American. We have a history of not allowing orthodoxy to guide our policy decisions. And this is where you all come in, because you are going to be the policy makers and the policy deciders faster than each of you think possible in this room. And if you become like the policymakers and the people who are leaders in Washington, for example, then you will do, in my view, a disservice to our country and to our history. Because again, our history as a country is to say that we want to solve problems and that we will not be dictated to by orthodoxy. The orthodoxy that is prevalent in our nation's capital has resulted in absolute paralysis. There are no problems being solved. There are no real problems being discussed. You can't even get people to agree on a problem and sit down. And then the culture, if you will, that has either created or has arisen from that, a culture where we have 30-second sound bites and clever Orwellian language to mask what the real policy is. And you have Fox News saying things, and on the other side, you have MSNBC saying the exact opposite. It is not leading our country anywhere other than paralysis. Now, I believe that both parties are at fault. And so, as an act of good faith, I'm going to share with you what I think the Democratic Party's faults are. With the Democratic Party, every issue that they have is a litmus test. So you can't just say, I believe that reproductive freedom is a decision that a woman should make. You have to say that I believe that reproductive freedom means late-term abortions and no parental consent. Is there room for people to disagree in a good, well-intentioned way about parental consent, about abortion? I think so. But there is not room in the Democratic Party that I know of. I have already talked about the systemic failure of urban public education in our country. And yet when Democrats are not allowed to sign on to or think about creative solutions that may run afoul of the unions, the teachers' unions. And in fact, if you even talk about charter schools, the teachers' unions will say to you, we will never support you again. Can't even talk about it. Can't even say, well, maybe the charter schools are doing something right in this instance, and why is it that a school in Harlem that's divided in half, the charter school students are graduating and yet the public school students aren't? You can't have that discussion. That is heresy. There is indeed, in my view, in the Democratic Party, no concept really of meaningful coalitions, no concept of striving together to find a middle ground to find solutions. Instead, it has become one constituency with another constituency with another constituency. And we have lost our ability to articulately argue for the compromise in the middle solution. Now, given that, I am still a Democrat, and in fact, one of my jobs, one of my roles that I have is I am the co-chair of the New York State Democratic Party. I'm proud to be a Democrat, and I am working to be somebody who is reforming the party and somebody who is thinking about and talking about solving problems, along with Governor Cuomo and others, solving problems and leaving orthodoxy behind. I believe that the solution to the Democratic Party is that well-minded Democrats in that party start talking about these things, perhaps taking risks. Now, for the Republican Party, I know that the Republican Party has been seized by radical social conservatives. And the Republican Party's rallying cry to me seems to be, we hate. We hate gays, we hate immigrants, we hate women who practice birth control, which, by the way, is every adult woman that I know. So we pretty much say we hate women. And when your rallying cry is hatred, along with rugged individualism, I think you are deemed to fail. Now, are you deemed to fail in 1 year, or 2 years, or 3 years? That's one of my roles as the Democratic chair, is to make sure that they're deemed to fail quickly. Your role is to make sure that people like me, that you demand people solve problems, first and foremost as Americans, that you repudiate and that you reject orthodoxy. Your role as Maxwell students, as people who are learning full-time, is to break those orthodoxies, is to say, this is why it doesn't make sense. Your role as public servants, as policymakers in a resource-constrained world, is to innovate. It is the tradition of American governance. That is your role. To innovate and to solve problems. And let me end with a quote from some great female American poets. Free your mind, and the rest will follow. So with that, I'd be happy to take any questions that you have.
Thank you so much. Please, questions?
Do the voters of Syracuse hear you say these things?
Yes. Not only do they hear me say these things, but I think they actually see the actions that I have taken as mayor and what my administration has done. So let me give you just a couple of examples of that. You know, in terms of where does your party enrollment, how does that influence you? Well, in Syracuse, I think of it this way. From 9 to 5, it doesn't really matter whether I'm a Democrat or not. And I work very closely with the Republican county executive. I work very closely with the Republican state senator. After 5 o'clock, that's when we talk about partisan issues and how we view the world, and how I view the world, and how it may differ. But in local government, and now I think under the leadership of the governor, but also with our state senators in particular, we focus on solving problems. Now, some would say, well, the reason you do that is because you can't evade problems. You're right. We got to figure out, how do we pick up trash on 690? Because it's intolerable to us. We can't hide behind talking about what Ayn Rand's position was and rugged individualism. We got to fix that problem. And we think about, how can we fix the issue of, we need more children to graduate in this, from city high schools. And it's not a Democratic issue or a Republican issue from 9 to 5. Now, afterwards, it may be, because there are definitely different ways that parties look at this. But for me, at a local government level, and what I find so refreshing about it, is that we never lose sight of what our primary responsibility is, and that is to serve the people and solve problems. Yes, sir.
It's a two-part question. The first part, what are the efforts from your office on inner-city economic development, specifically with regards to small business help and maybe asset management for vacant buildings? And the second part is there any room for Maxwell students while here to kind of help out with those types of issues?
Let me say that for me, the most profound economic development is education. And so if you've heard about Say Yes, you've heard about all the things that we're doing. And we do a lot. So for me, That's the most profound economic development. Secondarily, what we have done is worked with our partners and with government funding to work with people who are there already in neighborhood businesses, neighborhood restaurants, small loans, mentoring, partnerships, giving them access to capital. On the north side of the city, we have a burgeoning population of immigrants. And we have been able to give a number of immigrants small loans to start grocery stores that cater to their community. So those are the kind of things that we do. There are incubators, there are lots of assets that we are trying to put people in touch with and connect them. And the answer to your question about is there room for Maxwell students, we have been very fortunate. We've had a lot of Maxwell students come through my office in the city and put them in positions where you can really do good work and interesting work and have an impact. So yes, we are putting together right now, we have a land bank, and we are really putting the foundation together, no pun intended, I guess, or no metaphor intended, putting the foundation together to move the land bank forward to really look at innovative ways to deal with our vacant property. And they have, in Flint, Michigan, they've been very successful at doing that. We are kind of borrowing from Flint, Michigan and putting our own spin on it and moving forward with that. So it's exciting. It's a partnership with the county, which I talked about, working closely with the county executive. It's a partnership with the county, and it has not been done in New York State before, and we're on the cutting edge of doing that. Yes, ma'am.
Well, first of all, thanks a lot for coming here, because I think a really great part of being a resident of Syracuse, growing up here, and then being here at SU is seeing what this valuable resource is. And you talked in your speech about access to resources in terms of inequality. And so just to educate our population a little bit on, I'm very curious about the Destiny USA situation. And when we talk about equality of access to resources, and just as you were saying, small loans, how does the city play a part in that, and yourself specifically?
How does the city play a part? I'm not sure I understand. Tell me the question you want me to answer, because I could be here for 24 days, years talking about Destiny.
I'm sure you could. I guess how is the city invested in that, and what we see Destiny playing a role in our city in the future, and how it's going to help us?
The Destiny Project is a project that was conceived by some developers in Syracuse. And what they said to this community 10 years ago, 12 years ago, was that they were going to create a project so big and so enormous that the sales tax revenue that the city and the county would get as a result of this project would far exceed the property taxes. And they were able to, through the use of their resources, I'm trying to be very circumspect about how I answer this. So they had significant resources, and they were able to take those resources and persuade a majority of the governing bodies in the city and Onondaga County that this concept made sense. I was not part of that majority. And as a result, the current mall, the original mall, had a 15-year pilot where it was tax-free for 15 years. It escalated. The expansion which is over 800,000 square feet of retail space, maybe 1.2 when it's all said and done, will have a 30-year pilot. That 30-year pilot will also cover the pre-existing mall, so that mall will have had a 45-year pilot. They will pay no property taxes, or a bare minimum of property taxes in terms of, what the property before it was developed paid. And again, the thought was that all of that sales tax revenue would exceed property taxes. Now, property taxes, 70% of the property taxes in the city of Syracuse go to the school district. That's not true with sales tax, so the split is not the same. The developer also made a lot of promises, didn't make a lot of commitments. I brought that up at the time. My argument did not carry the day. The developer said it was going to be nothing like it in the world. And last month, the developer said we're going to stop. And so that project has got 30 years on the expansion, 45 years on the original mall. It is the single largest piece of taxable property in the city of Syracuse and in Onondaga County. It pays no property taxes.
Despite the failure of it to go forward.
Correct. So, you know, for me, the bigger issue right now is, again, I have a 10 to 12 year intimate, unfortunately, in some ways, relationship with this project. The bigger issue is, I think in terms of the city of Syracuse, there was a time when you talked about the city of Syracuse, its future was destiny, and that everybody sort of conceded that ground. That is no longer the case. When we talk about the future of the city of Syracuse, people don't talk about destiny as being the end-all and the be-all. Instead, we talk about a vibrant downtown, a creek walk, mixed-use development, say yes to education, uniting the University Hill with downtown, vibrant neighborhoods, pedestrian-friendly neighborhoods. We talk about why it is that people stay in the city of Syracuse, what it means to live in a city, and how we can continue to provide those amenities so that people feel that they have made the right choice, even a lot of people who don't have any other choice to make. Yes, ma'am. You, in the stripes.
Thank you.
You mentioned that you're big.
Sorry, right here. I'll get to you. You're in stripes too. You're in stripes too. I'll get to you next.
Lady in the stripes. Both my parents are educators, so I kind of have this like inevitable interest in it, even though it's not really what I'm pursuing. You talked about the incoming immigrant population and just the failure of public urban education. And I just wondered if you could speak a little bit about the EL program that was created about 5 years ago, how that's kind of a reflection of the changing demographics of the city, and then maybe your own vision of inclusiveness in serving those immigrant kids.
Well, interestingly enough, the immigrant population has done, by and large, very well in our city school district. So last year, 6 of the 8 valedictorian or salutatorians, maybe it was 10, 6 of the 10 were first-generation Americans. This year, offhand, I can think of 2 at the graduations, just that I think were, I can't confirm that. So the immigrant population has really seized these opportunities, and they have tremendous stories. And what our job, and I frequently say to people in my administration and other government officials, is if we can give this population the support they need for the first 3 to 5 years as they make this incredibly difficult transition, they become engines of economic development and engines of safety and security in our neighborhoods. And if you think about it, that's the history of the American dream, that we have welcomed immigrants and they have come in and they've worked very hard and they've stabilized cities and neighborhoods, and then their children went on to do bigger things and better things, if you will. So we have, I know a lot of mayors, my fellow mayors, talk about how their immigrant populations have really done, particularly in Utica, have done an amazing job of taking vacant property and redoing it, and stabilizing neighborhoods and making neighborhoods come alive again. So it's a real, I think, a real asset that we have, that we spend not enough time thinking, how can we make that transition smoother so that we can harness that asset afterwards. Yes, sir.
Well, of course, she kind of stole my question there. So we're thinking alike. But just to kind of piggyback off of that, when you say that the #1 economic development for you is education, how do you provide a smooth transition for those immigrant populations, whether it's through ESL programs or something like that? And you also mentioned Say Yes is a great way for access for higher education. But how do you combat the culture of the disintegrating working class into the working poor, and their lack of, recognition for education or focus on education, and more their focus on survival.
Well, we're trying to do that every day, and we're not alone in that. Jeffrey Canada's doing it in New York City, and other places. Rahm Emanuel's thinking about it in Chicago. We're all thinking about it. So, there's some very practical things, looking at using our community colleges more effectively, looking at providing English classes longer and giving more access to them for immigrants and refugees. As the federal government, by the way, has cut back, that's where, so all of this discretionary funding and big bloated government, that's where we are feeling it, is in our housing programs, in our services to vulnerable communities, which includes refugees and immigrants. So it has had a real cost. But what we're struggling with and what we are experimenting with in the laboratory that is Syracuse with Say Yes is providing supports to families so that survival is no longer their first struggle, that we can help them with whether they're getting thrown out of their apartment, whether their children need to sign up for health care to get glasses or dental care, whether they need tutoring, access, summer programming to make sure that they don't lose all of their skills during the 3 months of summer. So that's what we're doing. Yes, ma'am, in the back.
My question is more on collaboration and working, I guess, with other political parties, but then just like other groups that are in Syracuse. What is your view on compromise, and where do you draw the line?
I think compromise is a necessary part of governing. And I compromise every day. And it's, I can't give you an orthodoxy for how I answer that. I can tell you that, and most of the times I don't have to. Most of the times we collaborate in the city with everyone because we have to. One, we want to. But in a time of resources, in a resource-constrained world, whenever anybody says to me or to the city, I want to help, we sign them up. And so it's our nonprofit institutions, it's our educational institutions. Syracuse University is a vital partner with us. From Say Yes to Education to helping us with certain neighborhoods, there are a lot of projects that Say Yes does, and the chancellor has been a real leader in that. And so we collaborate, we compromise, and we move forward. Sometimes it's easier than others. Yes, ma'am.
I had another education-related question, actually. So I actually used to be a special education teacher in Los Angeles until I was laid off because of the budget cuts in 2008. So my question was, what do you see the future of education reform to be, given all of the cuts to education?
Well, I think that really is going to be, frankly, dependent on my party. And if the Democratic Party does not embrace reform in a meaningful way, then I think you're going to see a lot more hardship and a lot more suffering and a lot more people and populations left behind. If the Democratic Party continues to adhere to this orthodoxy, where, for example, in New York State, we spend the #1 amount of money in the country on education, and I think we're 35th or 36th in results. Used to be for a long time, people would say it's just money. You need more money, you need more money, you need more money. Well, money's part of it, but there's also a whole other host of issues that need to be addressed. And until the Democratic Party breaks through with that orthodoxy, or until Democrats themselves demand that their party and their leaders try to solve this problem. Arne Duncan is doing a fantastic job, but he needs partners, and clearly the Republicans aren't interested in partners. So the answer to your question really is I'm very worried about it, and I'm troubled by it. Yes, sir.
What about security? I come from Mexico, which is a very insecure place, and I found myself in the United States feeling more insecure to walk through the streets. I thought I was paranoid, so I Googled it. And actually, yes, Syracuse's crime rates are high. And I actually found a map when you can see where crimes happen. And I said, oh, that's the spot I'm planning to rent my new apartment. So what are you doing to
Well, you know, crime is an issue. Anytime a crime happens, it is wrong and very troubling. There are certain neighborhoods where more crime happens than others, and different types of crime. So, is it really any surprise that in a neighborhood that's close to a university where students walk, that perhaps burglars would target that, knowing that you all have iPads and computers and stereos and GPS systems and iPhones? It's not. You know, why did they rob banks? Because that's where the money is. Why is there burglaries there? Because that's where there are a promise of goods, and quite frankly, people are sometimes foolish about what they do with their $1,000 bicycles and their iPhones. Syracuse is a safe city. The problem becomes that when we see this violence happen, this is a city and a community and a part of the state where we're not used to this kind of violence. And so any violent act is an aberration. Unfortunately, I think the rest of the country has gotten used to the kind of violence that comes from drugs and drug crime. And so the shootings and the homicides are shots fired and our homicides are down. And we have a fantastic police chief who is in the streets all the time. We are using new technology from cameras to mapping and GPS systems. But it's something that you struggle with because people are desperate, and then they're with drugs, and violence goes right along with the drug crime. And if you're from Mexico, I know I don't have to talk to you about that. But that's one of the things that happens. And part of the rugged individualism, if I will sort of inject sort of a philosophical answer to your question, when there is no meaningful discussion about the Second Amendment to the Constitution in terms of what the right to bear arms really means. And the Democrats have completely abandoned this, other than a number of mayors, myself included, led by Mayor Bloomberg with Mayors Against Illegal Guns. The government in Washington, D.C. has completely and totally failed to enforce the current gun laws on the books. And so when we have gun crime in Syracuse, those guns are often, almost exclusively, from places like Virginia and Ohio, places where they don't have the kind of gun laws we have. But they come over our borders and they're used to commit crime. And the government in Washington, D.C. has said, it's not our problem, we're not going to think about it. Yes, sir.
You talked a lot about
You talked a lot about different things in our past, our country's past, that have sort of informed you, maybe, have informed your views. I guess I would like to know what sort of mayoral influences have informed you. Are there other mayors directly that have influenced the way you do things on a day-to-day basis, weekly, monthly, et cetera?
Well, I've been very fortunate in that I've had access to a number of truly great mayors, starting with Mike Bloomberg. He's just an unbelievable problem solver and has an first-rate intellect. And to see the kind of innovative policies that they are doing in New York City, and to be able to talk with him and watch how he thinks about things. Every single thing that comes across Mike Bloomberg's desk or psyche is a problem to be solved. And he'll come with a solution, or he'll hire the best and brightest to find solutions. And if you want to talk about, the triumph of pragmatism over orthodoxy, that's Mike Bloomberg. He will tell the joke about he's been a Republican, he's been a Democrat, now he's an independent. He's been all over the map. I guess maybe he's our own sort of Winston Churchill, if you will. And he believes in solving problems. And whether it's irrational gun crime, or for that matter, just gun crime, all gun crime is irrational. Whether it's gun crime, whether it's childhood obesity, whether it's minority males underachieving in society. I mean, these are intractable problems that have existed in our society for a long time, and everybody else has run away from them. Mayor Daley in Chicago is a phenomenal mayor, and I think Mayor Emanuel has picked up where he has left off. From my vantage point, and it sounds somewhat self-serving, but nevertheless I'm going to say it, when you talk about where the real innovative government policy is going on, it's in cities. Because again, we can't escape it. We need to solve those problems. And so the kind of person who right now is a mayor and is in that job is somebody who wants to solve problems. And in fact, I heard President Obama say this. There's a saying about Lyndon Johnson during the height of the Vietnam War. Things were just terrible. And they came and they said, you know, Mr. President, things are really bad. And he said, yeah, but you know, it could be worse. And they said, really, how could it be worse? He said, I could be a mayor. So if you know, I find it to be a profoundly rewarding job. And I am grateful almost every day that the people of the city of Syracuse gave me this incredible opportunity. But it is there is no shortage of problems, and there's a dramatic shortage of revenue. And when you put those two things together, it makes it a heavy burden. Yes, ma'am, in the red.
In your speech, you emphasized quite a lot about participatory democracy, and I'd be curious to hear what initiatives or programs your administration in particular has taken to include the people of Syracuse in the democratic process, whether it be through participatory budgeting or town halls. Thanks.
Oh, well, when you're a mayor, let me follow up with the answer I just gave. When you're a mayor, your life is participatory democracy. So everywhere I go, from when I step out of my house in the morning to when I get home at night, there is participatory democracy, because every person will tell you how you should be doing your job better or more effectively. And it could be from solving as profound as solving public education to as less profound as filling a pothole. And so that's part of how I feel. And in a city the size of Syracuse, that's what makes it great, is that there's no escaping. You know, I know my constituents. I see them every day, and they know my phone number's in the book. They know my email. They know how to get a hold of me. They stop at my office and say they want to see me. They call my office and say, I want to talk to Stephanie, and she told me I could talk to her. And my staff will come in and be like, I'll say, oh yeah, I told her, put her through. I'll talk to her. But for a more systemic answer to your question, we have town halls. We do not have, in any meaningful way, I think, participatory budgeting. I will tell you that I have never seen that be effective. So we publish our budget. There's a budget hearing on it. There's lots of talk about it. It's in the media. I have a citizens cabinet where every 2 years there's a rotation of people from different neighborhoods and different groups in the city that meet with me on a quarterly basis. We have a electronic system with the internet where people can look to see if their problems are being solved. We're expanding that, but the kind of regular routine problems where people want to know, did that pothole get fixed? Did that traffic light get fixed? Did the branch get cut from the stop sign? And I will tell you, with participatory budgeting, because I've seen that's kind of become a buzz, I don't really think it's fair. You know, I spend 15 hours a day. Every time I'm conscious, thinking about budgeting and numbers and understanding the relationship between bond ratings and federal funding and state funding, and what happens if Medicaid gets cut, even though it doesn't come directly to the city, it comes to the county. What about sales tax revenue? How does that impact it? What about our roads and how much we get reimbursed with TIP funding, and if that gets cut, and is that going to be cut? So there is a lot of expertise. It is a complicated process and a system, and to ask that people weigh in on that without having the ability to spend the kind of hours you need to get into the details to make an educated decision, I just don't think it's fair. It sets people up. Yes, sir.
Your speech talked a lot about something I've been hearing about since 2008, which is this whole, America is in peril, bad things are happening, whether it's the financial crisis or the rise of China or our bond rating going down. You've been hearing a lot of this lately. And in talking with others and professors or whatever, I've met some people who say things like, oh, that happened in the 80s, or that's not a big deal, or the dollar's still a pretty big deal, whatever. And my question is, is this really, in your opinion, are we entering the dark ages of America here? Or are we really just fluctuating within the parameters of normalcy?
Are we are we just in a cyclical recovery?
Right, and if it is outside of those parameters, how do we mobilize people to care more? Because for me, I'm not really buying into it personally. I would love to, but I need to see some, evidence.
Well, I do not think we're in a cyclical cycle. I think we're outside of that, and that's why this recovery has been so sluggish. And when you have, and I have part of my educating myself on our budgeting and our practices is talking to people who are a lot smarter and think about this kind of stuff a lot deeper than I have ever had the ability to do. And what they say to me is, when you look at the fundamental underpinnings of our economy, we used to be an economy that was based on manufacturing, 75% based on manufacturing. When you have that, you can have these cyclical cycles and you can recover. But we have now flipped it where we're based more on service and consumption. And we can't recover because of that. The recovery is going to be different. At the same time that we have, for years and years and years, spent, promised, and made commitments that we don't have the revenues anymore to buy, pay for. Pensions, huge example. I think healthcare will be helped with the Obama Affordable Care Act, but healthcare is another example. And so there is a very profound, and it's happening in cities now, in Stockton, California, Detroit, Central Falls, Rhode Island. You see cities going bankrupt. We don't, and if you look at just as an example, next week, Lieutenant Governor Ravitch is going to be he's been doing a study about unfunded pensions and where we are as a country. He's going to release the findings of those studies, along with Paul Volcker, his partner. And when you look at the unfunded liabilities of pensions, it's scary. And those are moral commitments that we have made to employees. At the same time, we've made moral commitments to bondholders, saying that we would be able to pay off these bonds that really are the way governments function. So it is different from things that have happened in the past. It's my view, educated in particular by Governor Ravitch and Paul Volcker, but others as well. I don't think we're entering the dark ages. I think that if you think about where they were in 1939 and 1940 and 41 in the United States, that had to be pretty bleak. Or in the Great Depression, equally bleak. Or right before the Civil War, during the Civil War, very bleak. My point, and why I tried to use some historical context to this, is that every generation has challenges that are put in front of them. And whether or not we enter the dark ages, or even how you define what dark ages is, because there are some, for example, Grover Norquist, I think would have a very different view of what America's dark ages would be from me. If there were no taxes at all, Grover Norquist would say we're in an age of enlightenment. I would not believe that, because I think taxes are a necessary part of what helps us promote the general welfare and how we spend it. So the answer to whether or not the United States is entering into a dark ages rests in your hands. The decisions that you make, from voting to policies to refusing to accept orthodoxy. I don't think that we are, and I'm going to use every bit of leverage that I have as a mayor, as a state party chairman, as an American, as a voter, to make sure that that doesn't happen, that the people and the issues and the constituencies that I care about are represented in the marketplace of ideas, if you will. Yes, ma'am.
mentioned misogyny in politics, and so I was wondering what
I don't
challenges.
think I used that. I don't think I did, actually.
Well,
But you tell.
hating
Oh,
of
well,
women.
yeah, that's right. With the Republicans and
But
women
you know,
and birth
wondering
control.
if that transfers over. I'm sure it does to some extent that you have challenges as a woman in politics. What have those been, and how have you overcome them?
I was very fortunate in my life that I had very strong grandmothers and a strong mother, and equally strong father and grandfathers. So my frequent line is, I had very strong women in my life and men who were smart enough to marry strong women. And as a consequence of that, I was raised in this environment where I could do whatever my brother did. And he was expected to do whatever I did. And I was in this little cocoon where it made no sense. It made no difference, if you will. And the people of the city of Syracuse, I think, are also in that same cocoon. Nobody ever said to me, oh, I'm going to vote for you because you're a woman, or I'm not going to vote for you because you're a woman. And I got all the way till about a week before the general election, or it was not an issue. And a week before the general election, an AP reporter must have done a Google or something and figured out that I would be the first woman elected to any of the big 5 cities. And he did a story. I think it was a he did a story. And the next thing you know, it became this huge media issue. It's never been an issue with my constituents, my voters, people I represent. I think, due to the fault of my grandmothers and my mother, I am somewhat oblivious to the misogyny or sexism. But there are times when you can't be oblivious to it. And during those times, I try to remember that it is the people of the city of Syracuse who elected me, not the media, not the talking heads who say things that are offensive. And I try to focus on that, and I try to be what others have been for me, which is a good role model, and make decisions and conduct myself in a way that would not embarrass my grandmothers and not embarrass my mother, certainly. Although sometimes with my mother that's difficult. So, so that's what I'd say about that. Yes, sir, in the green.
I have a sort of broader question. You said in your remarks that the question about the scope of government is sort of a uniquely American one. And I think that if you look at, other, say, advanced industrialized countries, they have welfare states. We have welfare state. It's a smaller one, but I think that's a difference of degree rather than kind. And so I was wondering if you could say more about why you think that's a uniquely American question.
Well, I think it's a uniquely American question, and I think I said, too, that perhaps it's because of my own vantage point, because I am an American. But I think it is a uniquely American question because of this profound tradition of rugged individualism that we have in our country. That, a country of immigrants where people were industrious and risk takers, and they left their home countries to make a better world for themselves. And that sense of being able to take a risk, wanting to take a risk, and landing on our shores and saying, government, don't oppress me. Or as the colonial flag said, don't tread on me. So if you look at issues about like the fight that our country had over smoking and whether smoking caused cancer, and then you look at what Europe went through, it was, I think, in my view, much easier in Europe for them to put on warning labels, to talk about smoking causing cancer. It was not that easy here, and it was a real struggle. So I think that the reason, and our welfare state is vastly different from Canada, most European states, for that matter from South America. My brother-in-law is Chilean, and that is a country that has had its fair share of tragedy and struggle, and yet, they have free education, free health care, free daycare for children. I mean, so you can talk about it in terms of scope, but the way I look at it is the scope is really a reflection of what society has said are appropriate choices for government. I believe, and again, it's my belief from my vantage point, that in our country, we have erred more towards rugged individualism in the Bill of Rights and and holding those individual rights sacred. And with other modernized welfare states, if you will, they have, the pendulum is much closer to being able to do things for the collective good. Yes, sir, in the orange.
In a city like Syracuse that's very for environmentalism, I just was curious to hear your take on what the role of your office and you think the role that environmentalism plays, especially in a city with so many other issues. Yeah, I'd just like to hear more.
Well, that has been a huge sea change in this community. So 10 years ago, it was not the case. 10 years ago, the guiding policy was to treat Onondaga Creek as a fast way to get garbage to Onondaga Lake. And what really changed that was the county executive, shortly after she was elected, saying, you know what, maybe there's a better, more forward-thinking way. Maybe we shouldn't think of Onondaga Creek as a transit system for our garbage and our floatables. It's a nice one. I always like that, our floatables. For those of you who don't know what floatables are, we can talk about that afterwards. It was the county executive's leadership and saying, and I think there was, it's again, where voters and activists have this role, because there was clearly an outcry for thinking about our environment as being stewards and being more forward-thinking, and thinking about green technology and not necessarily gray. And the county executive recognized that. She herself took big risks and has been very innovative and has been, she's gotten lots of plaudits from across the country, from the EPA and Governing Magazine. But it was a case of a leader doing the right thing and constituencies in the community applauding her for it, supporting her for it, and saying we won't turn back. And so my role, for me in the city, it's very easy, because in a city like Syracuse, you can talk about, when you're in a city, you can talk about the environment, as much as that may seem sort of counterintuitive, because when you talk about issues like the environment, people who live among a lot of asphalt and concrete tend to really appreciate green space. And they don't want the little waterfront that they have being treated like a toilet. If you live outside in suburbia, and you probably have more money, and you can go and visit lakes and do other things. And so, it's maybe I am extrapolating too much, but it's been a very easy series of decisions to make in the city, and there's been very little obstacles to that. Yes, sir.
I have a couple current event questions for you. The first being the north side of Wegmans. Has there been any discussions with them about selling the building to another grocer, or what are the talks like with them?
Well, I don't want to get into discussions that I have had, but suffice it to say that there have been discussions. They've been positive discussions, and Wegmans has a great reputation that they have earned for doing the right thing for the people that they serve in the cities and constituents that they are. So I have nothing but good things to say about Wegmans.
About a month ago, I read an article on Syracuse.com that the city is supposed to be bankrupt by 2015. What steps are the city taking to prevent that? And if the city were to go bankrupt, what does that mean for the community?
Since I got into office in 2010, and I can tell you virtually the date, it was in March of 2010, we were preparing my first budget as mayor, and I'm no mathematician, let me put that out, right? I'm no mathematician. It's a cosmic irony that my life every day is spent with math. I kind of feel like, Michael Dukakis and I Saturday Night Live routine where I was told there was no math. Not true to be mayor of the city of Syracuse. So in March of 2010, I was putting together a budget, and we were projecting on using, let's say, $13 million in fund balance, and then I looked at how much fund balance we had, 50, and I was like, 13 goes into 50 3 times. Wow, we need help. So what we have been doing every year is doing what we can. We've negotiated zeros with our unions. This year, I raised health insurance premiums for management confidential employees. We have the smallest workforce that we have ever had. We instituted an early retirement program. When people leave through retirement, we look at it very closely as to whether or not we need that position. We have made a real strong push to do a lot more with technology and update our technological infrastructure so that we can become more efficient, so that we won't have to have as many people. So we're doing a lot every single day and have been for 3 years, but our pensions in 10 years have gone up 700%. Actually, I think it's 900% now that I think about it. And I have no control over that. The state government sets the age that people retire. It sets what their contributions are going to be. It sets whether or not they actually make a contribution. And so when your bills are going from $2 million to $30 million, that's very tough to control. I can't control that. Similarly, I cannot control a large portion of our health insurance because our largest unions have compulsory binding interest arbitration, which means an arbitrator will set the rate. And so for our police union, for active family coverage, they pay $30 a month for health insurance. That's very low. So one of the things that I'm doing is I put together a group of experts to help advise me. I'm meeting with my fellow mayors, talking about a strategy, and we will. There has never been a city in New York State that has gone bankrupt. It's very unusual for cities to go bankrupt. Could be a new phenomenon for the 21st century. What happens in New York State is before they reach that, the state comes in and puts in a financial control board, and then the financial control board is empowered to make decisions that you can't otherwise make. So in other words, when the state puts in a financial control board, traditionally then they allow the financial control board to discard all the rules and regulations surrounding collective bargaining agreements and healthcare contributions and things like that. So the answer to your question is we are doing all that we can every day to advocate, to look for creative solutions, but the government of Syracuse will look very different in 2 years from how it looks now. And I think that is true for all city governments.
And my final question is, I know this is a major project, and I think a lot of people agree that the university can connect with the downtown area if 81 gets removed. What is your opinion, and what do you believe is going to happen with 81? Are they going to take it down, or are they going to rebuild it? Or?
I don't think that decision, I know that decision hasn't been made. I'm in favor of removing 81. Again, it's a very easy position for me because as the mayor of this city, I don't think that we should have a road that makes it easy to get from one side of the city to another in 10 minutes. My view is cities exist for neighborhoods and for people and complete strangers to get together and to live together, and the creativity that comes out of it. To have that barrier right in the middle of it is doing a lot of damage. So I'm in favor of tearing it down. And the state is looking at it, and they're crunching numbers and trying to figure out, the impacts that it will have.
Do you have a say in that, or is it a state issue only?
I have a say. We have a say. The city has a say. Yes, ma'am.
I know that this university and this chancellor in particular does a lot to work with the city of Syracuse and build a partnership. But as a big part of the city, what's something you wish the university either partnered in that they don't already or did on their own to sort of build a better relationship?
I'll tell you that I cannot think of something where the university could be active with us where they aren't. Every time I have asked, they have said yes, and even before I've asked, and no pun intended would say yes either, through the leadership of the chancellor, it's been a profound sea change in how the relationship between this university and the city has gone forward. And she's been a great partner, and the institution has been a great partner. Does that mean that we agree on everything? No. But what it means is that when there's a problem, they come to help. If I ask, they come to help solve it. Yes, ma'am.
One of the first things I noticed when I moved here and began hanging out with some locals and stuff is the passion behind the anti-hydrofracking issue. And I just wanted to know what your involvement is in that and kind of what your experience has been in the area and how the community has mobilized around that issue.
Well, I think that that is an offshoot of the environmentalism that you find a big part of this community. But also, the city of Syracuse, we get our water primarily from Skaneateles Lake. We are one of only 2 cities in New York State that has a waiver, a filtration avoidance waiver. So we don't have a filtration system. The other city is New York City. There is Marcellus shale around Skaneateles. So my administration's role very early on was to make sure that we advocated to take hydrofracking, or the possibility of hydrofracking, off the table in terms of Skaneateles Lake because of the risk that it would do to our drinking water, which we thought was not worth taking. And we were successful in doing that. The hydrofracking debate has kind of moved on to other planes and other levels. And because Skaneateles we were able to accomplish that goal, so our drinking water is not at risk. This is something that I follow, but I am no longer in the leadership of that. Yes, sir.
I really appreciated your sense of urgency with regards to education, and understandably so. Every day that a child is in front of a less than effective educator, it's really almost a lost economic opportunity for that student. But we do live in this resource-constrained world. When you're asking, 0% negotiations, you said it's also difficult to ask unions for reform. And just inherently, change can be slow and messy, and yet we have this immediate problem. Every year that you wait, it's, you can count them, the number of students who are lost. And so I'm curious, as a mayor, what strategies or tools do you use to try and create change in a more kind of efficient and immediate way?
Well, the biggest piece of leverage that I have is the fact that we're in a financial crisis. So when you're in a financial crisis, what you can say to people is, we can no longer afford to do what we're doing. So there is going to be change. The question is, do you want to help frame that change, or do you want to sit on the sidelines and watch it happen? And then I also talk a lot about why we're changing and what we have to change and the consequences of that are. So it's really trying to educate people about where we're going, and if we are not, there's a saying about change before you have to, and that's what I talk a lot about. And I have, whether it's because of the size of this community or whether it's because the particular personality of this community, everybody understands that, pretty much everybody, and is willing to work to try to make the change better for everyone and to use it as an opportunity so that we can minimize the hardship that will be affected upon people in the city. I don't think that that holds true on other levels of government. Yes, ma'am.
Just going along with the theme of education, you said there was a pretty high dropout rate in public schools. I was just wondering how you deal with that high number of students that have failed and what resources are made available to them, and how you feel about maybe a vocational education system, or maybe building up apprenticeships so they have an alternative to go with, and how effective you think that alternative might be.
We do that, and vocational training and apprenticeships. We have a joint school construction board projects where we're renovating 4 schools, and that's part of how we're trying to get people into those jobs, people from the city, through apprenticeships and the training program. But I have there's a fundamental, in my view, problem with the basis of your question. Let me tell you what it is. If kids are dropping out in 8th grade, then they can't do the math necessary to become an electrician or a plumber. So, you know, and that's what I mean about having real meaningful discussions about solutions. And I hear this a lot about, well, you know, not every kid's meant to go to college. We're probably right, but we're not talking about, what we are saying is give them opportunities. And if you can't do high school level math, given how complex our economy has become, you can't become the plumber, the carpenter, the electrician to put in the UV system on the water system that will get rid of bacteria, because it requires math, it requires science, it requires those kind of things that are taught. And in a modern industrial economy, without those kind of skills, you are metaphorically dead. And so we need to get kids to graduate from high school, and we can't say, well, not every kid's meant to go to college. No, but you know what? We want to be able to give them the skills necessary so that they can make that determination for themselves, their families can make that, and that they can make those choices. But if you allow it, and I know these numbers, if most children, if you will, if they struggle through 8th grade, they will not have enough credits when they go into 9th grade, and that's when they'll drop out, or right along there, because they're just behind from the beginning, and they feel like they can never get up and then get over that, and then they drop out. And if you drop out at those grades, you don't have the skills. You know, you can't become an electrician, you can't become a plumber, you just don't have it. Yes, ma'am.
I was an economics major with a specialization in public finance. And my question is...
Do you want to come work for me?
My question is... how do you understand the intergovernmental fiscal relations here in the United States? And how do you understand the art of municipal governance?
Well, the question was, how do you understand municipal government and the relationship with money and fiscal implications? When you are in a financial crisis and when budgets become so much a part of your life that every decision that you make, you have to think about the budgetary impacts, you very quickly learn to understand where does the money come from, and when your member of Congress votes to slash discretionary funding and housing policy, you understand very directly that those votes have an impact on how many houses we'll be able to build for refugees and immigrants, affordable units. So my point is, the decision that we make is impacted by where the money comes from. And so when we start making decisions, we got to understand how that money comes from. I don't know as much as my finance commissioner knows about that. I don't know as much as my budget commissioner knows. But I know more about the political part of it than they do, and that's part of putting together a good staff, is having everyone around the table who has a level of expertise that is probably deeper than I have, on those special areas, and being able to make educated and the right decisions based on those experts in those things. And you put them all together, and that's when you have policy. Yes, ma'am.
Good afternoon, Mayor. As a native Central New Yorker, I have followed you for years, and I appreciate you being here with us. My question has to do with, you talked about the problems, and you talked about County Executive Joni Mahoney a little while ago, a couple of questions ago. The problems don't just stop at the boundary of the city of Syracuse. They go into the county, they come into Madison County. What kind of new, innovative collaboration, shared services are you guys working on now? Because Central New York has a lot of really great central regional projects. What's new on the horizon?
Well, The county executive and I have done a lot of work on that area, from merging the purchasing department. We have a joint economic development office. We share an arborist. So we've done a lot of work on that and continue to. The green infrastructure and Save the Rain program, because we have most of the infrastructure in the city, most of that work has been done in the city, so our staffs have worked very closely on that. So wherever there is an opportunity to be more efficient and more effective, we do it, even when we know we're going to get a fight from our legislatures. The issue and collaboration this year, we saw leaders from across political leadership, business leadership, institutional leaders get together and work on a regional economic development plan for Central New York. And as a result of their hard work, we got the single biggest award of any of the regions in New York State. So that was an example of collaboration, working together. But collaboration also can only go so far, because the missions of some governments, a lot of the governments that people traditionally think about, are very different. So for example, a lot of people will say, well, you know, why doesn't the city just merge with the county? Why don't you guys just get it over with? You like Joni, she likes you, just get it over with. I have a police force. Joni does not. There's a sheriff that's an independently elected sheriff. I have a professional fire department. The county executive does not. I have a DPW department that is renowned in the world for cleaning snow. And Central New York, our economy is based on what happens in the city of Syracuse. If the Department of Public Works is not able to clear snow, then our businesses, our institutions, our hospitals all crumble. You will not see a state of emergency in the city of Syracuse due to snow. It's not going to happen. It happens every place else. It doesn't happen here because our people are so good. That's not a service that the county provides. Each of the towns provides that, but that's very different from the kind of service that we provide. So the county is, by and large, a social service organization. So I don't provide social services directly. Now, there are a large portion of my constituents who are on social services, who utilize social services. So I work with the county and we do it indirectly. That's when the missions that you have are very different. You can't just merge them and say, get it over with. And people like to think, well, you know what, the city, it's going bankrupt. And you know what, so why doesn't the county just take over the city and then we won't have bankruptcy? I mean, I've heard that talked about too. The same issues that impact the city impact the county. Pensions, healthcare, they're just healthier because they're bigger and they have not been in existence as long as we have. But if our society doesn't solve this issue about pensions and healthcare, Onondaga County is going to be on that list too. Because right now, Rockland County is, Nassau County is in a financial control board, Suffolk is in a financial emergency. So again, that's why you need people of intentions with the accurate information sitting down and figuring out how do we solve this problem. You don't need sound bites or people who just say things without understanding what's really behind that. Yes, sir.
Thank you for coming here today. I want to ask you a question about a comment you made earlier. You said that communities exist in greater prosperity when they exist together. And I totally agree with this 100%. There's greater prosperity and happiness per capita in cooperating towns. But cooperation and community is a belief and a behavior, and not necessarily an obligation. And just because you provide an opportunity for it by maybe removing 81 or whatnot does not mean that it'll exist. So how will you supplement initiatives like removing 81 in order to encourage people to work together and to bring the community at large as one?
Well, I think that it's the community that's got to demand it. It's the community that's got to demand cooperation. And if all of the voters in the United States said to their congressperson, we are not going to allow you it is unacceptable that you haven't focused on the economy, that you're, doing these other things, you would see them stop. I mean, we're elected for a reason. We're responsive to our constituents. So it's up to the community to demand that cooperation. I find in cities that it happens naturally because you have to do that in order to exist. You know your neighbor, you're going to see your neighbor, and so if they're doing something that irritates you, you have a choice. You either get over it or you ask them to stop. And that happens day in and day out, and the kind of mindset that comes out of that are in my view, people who are kind of more laid back than others about certain things. And so, and maybe it's just a product of being in Syracuse, but I don't ever find a problem with cooperation. Now, are there certain people who don't cooperate? Absolutely. Are there troublemakers in every group? Absolutely. I used to be named one of them. But the more that you focus on the solution and the more that you demand that you focus on the solution, I find that the group dynamics and leadership will, those voices will be silenced. Yes, sir.
Thank you, Madam Mayor. I definitely enjoyed the presentation about discarding orthodoxy and coming together and rallying for the public good. But you also serve as the co-chair of a party, of a major political party that, at its very core, is orthodoxy. So how do you reconcile this idea of your 9 to 5 working as a nonpartisan, perhaps, that you put aside the political affiliation, and then after 5 o'clock, you're right there, ready to just knock down the Republican Party or the Conservative Party?
Well, one, I do it because I think that is the American dynamic, and that's what we have always done as a society in different ways. Ronald Reagan had the different view. Ronald Reagan said from 9 to 5, we're partisan, and after 5, there's no such thing as Democrats and Republicans. I believe that there are certain ways that you should look at policy choices. And you're right, at the core of the Democratic Party are certain principles. And how you take those principles and how they become policy, that's an inter-party struggle that we have based on leadership and, Bill Clinton, Andrew Cuomo, versus John Kerry or FDR, or Jimmy Carter. They're all Democrats, but very different Democrats. So part of what I view my role is to help define what is the soul of the 21st century Democratic Party in New York State, for that matter. But I solve problems. And if there's a way to solve a problem that is not 100% Democratic orthodoxy, I solve it. Because for me, the best elected officials are not Orthodox Party people. So I don't think FDR was an Orthodox Democrat, although he redefined what being a Democrat was. In many ways, just like Bill Clinton redefined what being a Democrat was, just like Ronald Reagan redefined what being a Republican is, and right now, people in the Republican Party are struggling to redefine what it means to be a Republican. Part of, and I'm kind of surprised that this question hasn't come up yet, that somebody hasn't said, well, Mayor, what about a third party? Isn't it time that we just said, a pox on both their houses and we should have a third party led by pragmatists? And the answer is, I think, in our tradition, the party that reaches out and figures out how to have a big tent and encompass those people in the middle, those independents, whatever, NASCAR dads or soccer moms, whatever the vernacular is of the time, whatever party can do that is the party that will win. And right now, we happen to be beneficiaries of living in a time where both parties are trying to struggle and through that process figure out how you do that or whether you have to do that. And so I view my role as both as a state party chair to help define what it means to be a Democrat in the 21st century, but also to talk about what it means when you have Republicans in office. So there is a very big difference between the current congressperson that we have and the views that she has versus a Democrat. So for example, she doesn't believe in climate change. She doesn't believe that that's an issue. That's a big issue as we sit here sweating in 95 degrees in Syracuse. And even if you don't think it's an issue in terms of whether it's man-made or it's really happening, it is an issue for us as an economy because the rest of the world has decided that climate change is a real issue, and they're hungry for products that can help keep them carbon neutral. And those products are being developed in places like Syracuse, at ESF, at O'Brien and Geer, at the Center for Excellence. That's where those products are. So if you are an elected representative and you say, I don't believe in climate change, I don't think it's a real issue. Okay, so for me that means you don't believe in science. It's a big problem for me. Number one. Number two, it means that, well, what happens when Neil Murphy, who's the head of ESF, discovers, you know, I'm trying to think of Kirsten Gillibrand came with all this grass, you know, my policy director is here, the grass that we think is going to help make us sustainable. And he says, here's a better example, that Neil Murphy says, I have chemists who have found biological plants that can make a substitute for gasoline and for fossil fuels. But what we need is help, startup capital or government help to help us do that. If you have a representative who doesn't believe in climate change, you think she's going to be open to that? And if you have a representative who doesn't believe in climate change, then where are we as a city and a community going when we have so much of our economic engines devoted to issues of sustainability? So I think I just told you how I balance the two. Is there anyone else?
One last question.
So I was going to ask you a question about Say Yes to Education, because I've heard some sort of mixed reports, and I was listening to everyone's questions and you talking about the budget issues you're facing and how all of a sudden it's like, oh, 3 years, and if we don't do something, we're going to run out of money. And my thought was, well, I mean, we could sit here all day asking you about all these political questions relating to your city. And I think the question that sort of came to my mind was how did we get here in the first place? And I think the answer in a lot of ways is pretty obvious in the sense of, well, it was either, you know, poor management or poor leadership. But I'm just kind of wondering what your general thought is, because obviously we've had a lot of smart people around for a long time, and we still, you know, maybe you can answer it in Syracuse specifically or what your thoughts are broadly. We still have a lot of, I mean, pretty intractable problems that if we had gotten ahead of 20, 30 years ago, like when we knew they were coming, that they wouldn't have stopped. I mean, I think we all sort of know the answer, but I'm wondering what your perspective is.
The answer, in my view, is that in a democracy, it is very difficult to solve a problem that you know is coming down the road 2 years, 3 years, 5 years, 10 years, that's a lifetime. In a democracy, people are worried about the kind of cycle, the year to year. And so there are people who worry in longer vantage points, longer years. They're in think tanks. That's where you guys, some of you guys are going to go. They're policymakers. They're people who warn about this. But actual decision making doesn't, in my view, doesn't come until you have a crisis. That's when you change things. That's when you can inflict, if you will, the difficult part of change. For me, what I try and what I'm struggling with is, can I bring us to crisis before the hardship hits? So I don't think I have to manufacture a crisis. It's here, city of Yonkers, city of Buffalo, the other places. But what I'm trying to do is solve the crisis before it has an impact on my people. And I think that that is pretty innovative in a democracy, and the jury is out. So if you ask people right now in the city of Syracuse, how do you like your city? They'll have complaints. We're Americans, we complain about everything. They'll have their complaints. But you ask them, and they're happy with their services, and they're happy with their quality of life. There could be improvement, but they think it's a pretty good place to live, as evidenced by objective factors that we didn't lose the kind of census, we didn't lose the kind of population that other upstate cities did in the census. Objective criteria in terms of how the reelection rates and how people are going, and also just the fact that I got elected because I kind of understand people and I can get them to vote for me, so I understand, I believe, at least 50% plus one how to move the city forward. But as I talk about this crisis, there's this kind of this cognitive dissonance, because they say to me, and the newspaper said this to me, well, Mayor, you talk about this crisis, you've been talking about it for 3 years, and yet, you know what, my neighborhood's pretty good. My roads are plowed, my streets are good, they pick up my trash. If there's a crime, I call 911, the cops come, the fires get put out. Yeah. I want to change these decisions and change these policies and put in changes before that happens, before people say, my house burned down, like in Detroit, because I called and no fire trucks came, because the city couldn't afford fire trucks. So as a political matter, it's a very different way from handling the situation than I have seen others who have gone before. The others have kind of been like, well, you know what, somebody will solve this crisis before it becomes a crisis. And, you know, I'm a politician, so I don't want to give people bad news. The newspaper did an editorial cartoon where they made me the Grim Reaper. So I specialize in giving people bad news. Why? Because I want to drive the crisis before it becomes a crisis that people feel in the streets of the city of Syracuse. I'm not sure I can do it, but my choices were very clear. My choices were ignore it and hope that it goes away, hope that somebody else solves it, and leave office before it becomes a crisis, or be open and honest and transparent and talk about it and try to be part of the solution. I chose the latter. You can talk to me in another couple of years about whether that was the right choice or not. We'll see. So thank you all very much.
Think of a better way to close out this colloquium week, also to send you all off into public administration and democracy next week. We're going to take up these issues again, and so I just, on behalf of the Maxwell School, on behalf of the MPA class of 2013, want to offer a very small token of our appreciation, but also thank you so much for taking the time out of what is obviously much more than a 9-to-5 job, running the city of Syracuse, to come here and talk to us and share your thoughts. So once again, please thank Mayor Scho. Speaking for me, it has been wonderful getting to meet all of you this week. I've had a great time. I hope all of you have had a really good time. But first we have an announcement.